I'll take 2 minutes and be really quick. I should say to Tom and a few others, I suppose, that if you were inclined to say the Australian founders didn't want a Bill of Rights back in the late 1890s, but that's 100 years ago, 120 years ago. Since then, there have been two referenda, two constitutional referenda, one in 1944 and then one in 1988 that the proponents kept it simple. Just the right to free speech and the right to freedom of religion were proposed. It lost in every state. The highest support it got in one state was 37%. That's the voters in Australia. Of course, today, if you had a referenda of lawyers and law professors, it would get about 98% approval. The Australian Legal Academy is more one-sided than the US, easily. I tend to disagree with Grant on the UK Statutory Bill of Rights because of the way it's tied into Europe. It's a statutory Bill of Rights, but there are people like Eileen Cavanaugh at Oxford saying that the UK judges are now more potent and more powerful than the US Supreme Court. I tend to think that's right. I agree with Larry that it's illegitimate because they're doing it all through the reading down provision, which is Section 3, I think, off the top of my head. Thirdly, I never said that amending the Australian Constitution was tough. I said that they've had 44 tries and they've only done it 6 times. The procedure for amending the Australian Constitution is procedurally easy. You ask your fellow citizens, and if half of them agree, plus half the voters and over half the states, it goes through. Compare that to 2/3 of each house plus 3/4 of the states. That's way harder procedurally. The thing about Australia is it has a great constitution. So when you ask people to amend it, they give you the proper answer. No. I don't really see how that makes it procedurally tough. I've gone through the 44 questions, and I pretty much would have voted. This probably tells you why it's wrong. I would have voted with the voters on just about every one of them. So I don't agree, although you hear this all the time. It's not procedurally tough just because you lose votes. You can't even convince, 33 times, you can't even convince half the voters. So I should have mentioned, of course, that one of the oddities about Australia is there's compulsory voting, and they have 2 different voting systems. For the lower house, they have effectively first past the post voting that's improved. It's preferential voting, so you get the majoritarian benefits that you get here in the US and the UK. And then for the upper house, they have the Irish STV system. The result of that is it's almost impossible for the government, the party that wins the lower house, to control the upper house. You've got your checks and balances there. Once in a blue moon, you can have a prime minister who's so powerful like Howard that he controls the upper house for a short period of time. But you have to take it from me that the 2 voting systems can make it very hard. There's always a handful of off-the-wall independents who have the balance of power in the upper house. And the last thing I will agree with Grant is that when the judges in Australia are trying to infer some of these implied rights, so-called implied rights, the way they did in 1992, which was 4 years after the last failed referendum, it's so patently illegitimate without a Bill of Rights that they come under such pressure that it is hard. It is hard. And sure, this is all marginal stuff, I have to agree. Compared to what kind of decisions are made with the Bill of Rights, the things that the top Australian judges are doing are fairly peripheral because it's so patently clear that they're just making it up as they go along that they just find it hard to do.
Well, terrific. Okay, so we've got a burgeoning queue. Our first trio, Larry Solom, Stephen Sachs, and I'll put myself in that trio impertinently. Larry.
Yes, well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Grant. And so I want to just say 2 things. One thing is a pitch for comparative constitutional theory and Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And the second thing is a question about legal culture. So just the pitch, lots of people in this room are already familiar with some of the very important work that's been done by scholars in Australia and Canada and New Zealand. And I just want to particularly emphasize the very important role that Jeff Goldsworthy has played. And it's especially important, I think, to acknowledge his early contributions. Many things that are associated sort of loosely with New Originalism come from Jeff's work as the sort of a pioneering version. His work is very sophisticated and important. And if you're not familiar with it and you're an originalist or a critic of originalism, I think that this work is very important. And just another pitch, this guy is not writing about constitutional theory, but he is writing about interpretation theory. It's a guy named Richard Eakins. He's a Kiwi. He's a New Zealander, currently at Oxford. He has a very important book on legislative intent that will be of great interest to intentionalists in the originalist camp. And I just think this work is very, very important. And just, I think that sometimes both originalists and critics of originalism assume all the important work is being done in the United States, and that's just not the case. So here's the question, questions about legal culture. And it's really directed to both Jim and Grant. And so here's the question. So I would characterize sort of the dominant legal culture of the United States as having been pervasively influenced by legal realism, right? So that there's a certain, it's not that these things aren't in dispute, but that a whole set of instrumentalist ideas about law and a whole set of moves that are just accepted as regular judicial moves. They have critics, but you're definitely not considered a weirdo, right? If you take a provision of law, you say, here's the purpose, then you disregard the text and substitute the purpose for the text. Like, that's a move that's totally within the mainstream. And on the other hand, when I talk to Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders, I get the feeling that even though there are some moves in the direction of the legal culture of the United States, things are still very different. So I was recently at a conference hosted by Monash, and sort of I forget what this clause says. It's the company clause, and it functions in some way similar to the commerce clause. You can correct me about what exactly the clause says, and I was there was all this stuff, and I was saying, look, if you really believe that there ought to be national power in Australia to legislate on matters of national concern, why not just sort of have a Cooter-Siegel clause? That is, a clause that says something like, on matters of truly national concern, where the states cannot act, the national government has power to act. And all the Australians in the room looked at me like I was from Mars. Why? Because it would be inconceivable that you would write such a provision into the Constitution and ask judges to answer the question whether something was really, truly of national concern. It's just not a proper judicial role. So the question is, how different do you see the legal culture of Australia or Canada, or both, from the legal culture of the United States?
So I thought this was a really useful paper, and I appreciate both the paper and the comments. And I think that the real utility of it, especially here, is that it shows a couple things. So one is that there are many countries in the world, and not all of them are originalists, and some of them are, and some of them are less so, and some of them are only partially. It also shows that countries and legal systems that are originalists can become less originalist at various times, and sometimes might cease to be originalist entirely, or might become so over time. So that this is not a timeless determination. And what I want to ask is sort of, how do those two things influence something else that Jim said, which was that sort of there are two families of justifications for originalism. Either you're an originalist because you think, for normative reasons, in the sense you think it sort of advances whatever first-order moral objectives you have, or for interpretive reasons, you just think it's the right way to read stuff, and if this is stuff that's part of our law, this is how we read it. It seems to me that neither of those claims really work out all that well when we take sort of both geographic and temporal diversity into account. I mean, you can have normative defenses might work some ways in some places, in some countries, in different ways in other countries, and aren't necessarily going to work on the whole Constitution at once. There might be parts of it that inhibit your normative goals, et cetera, et cetera. And interpretive theories are are unlikely to be applicable always and everywhere. So you could imagine having 4 countries. You have Larry Solomon land, where whenever they pass enactments, they always expect that they will be understood according to their original public meaning. You have the Republic of Alexandria, where it's always read according to the original semantic intentions. You have Tom Kolbistan, in which there are a wide variety of additional sources of legal content, such as contemporary values and sort of popular acceptance. Maybe you have Larry Tribegway. I mean, who knows? There are all sorts of countries that could operate on different principles, where it would be very strange to say that they're sort of doing it wrong in the sense of applying their own rules of recognition to determine the content of their own law. So with that said, I guess the question is, doesn't that indicate that there's really a separate family of justifications for originalism? Namely, there's stuff in our rules of recognition, or that we accept, that somehow entails originalism through whatever chain of reasoning you get there. And isn't that in some way the only good justification for being an originalist if you're trying to obey the legal system as it is, as opposed to ride in and reform it in some way that you think would cause the legal system to be actually break from the existing system but make it better?
Oh, yeah. So, I'll jump in too. I was working at the Australian High Court when Australian Capital Television was decided, and feel like I should say a little bit about that. That Jim has sort of characterised in his paper the court's finding of an implied freedom of political speech that would preclude the government from the Parliament from regulating political advertising on television as effectively as a 6-to-1 story, where 6 find the implied freedom and 1 doesn't, and the 6 are being non-originalist implicitly, and the 1 is perhaps being originalist. I'd like to suggest that the reasoning in the individual opinions is a little more nuanced than that, in that we could really say it's a 4-to-3. There are 4 justices who I think their reasoning can be characterised within an original public meaning framework when we're asking the question, what does the phrase directly chosen by the people involve? Right? So let's start with one of the 4, the dissenter. The dissenter, the most conservative justice on the court, nonetheless concedes that if the Parliament had legislated in a way that precluded all access to information about candidates, the people just had no way to know who these people were, really, and what they stood for,
that would be incompatible with the constitutional guarantee that the people were directly choosing the members of the Parliament at the next election, that the concept of choice involves some access to information intrinsic to it, that an informed choice is part of what that concept involves. So even Dawson, the most conservative, was sort of saying, yes, my quibble is that this restriction on political advertising on TV at election time is not sufficient to create that kind of problem. And 3 of the other justices reason in a way that's closely hewed to trying to ask the question, what does this language involve? What's necessarily involved in the language? Contrast that with the 3 other justices, Toohey, Goodwin and Dean, who take what one could only say is an illustrative conception of the text. They're not asking, what does this concept of direct choice involve? They're saying, this language exemplifies, illustrates a system that has a lot of other things in it, nowhere mentioned in the text. A bigger concept that we see exemplified in this way, among others, and we're going to choose to identify the concept for ourselves and then explicate other ways that concept limits what government can do, right? So the bigger concept we're going to say is representative parliamentary democracy, a phrase nowhere in the text, and then we're going to say what else is involved in that concept. And we're going to say, freedom of speech is one of the things involved in that concept. What guidance did they get from, say, the United States and in its jurisprudence in making that kind of fairly dramatic move? Well, while the case was under consideration after oral argument, Planned Parenthood and Casey came down. And if you look at the plurality in Planned Parenthood and Casey, Kennedy and O'Connor and Souter are saying, well, obviously the due process clause doesn't say liberty, it doesn't just say, freedom to do whatever we think is important. But for a long time, our court has sort of taken this view that we've got this text that's talking about seems to be just about the procedures under which you mess with people's lives and whether you can lock them up. But in fact, we've treated it as exemplifying or illustrating a bigger idea called liberty. Nowhere mentioned freestandingly in the text, but nonetheless exemplified. And in this way, we get to take this illustrative conception and then limit government in ways nowhere mentioned in the text that also come within this bigger concept of liberty, right? So that the Australians look at, that's there on the radar when this decision comes down, and there's some illumination obtained from that. So I just thought, seeing I was there at the time, I would mention that that's part of the reasoning involved. The backdrop for this phrase, directly chosen by the people, included a free press in which political campaign of advertising was happening, and the four justices who hew closely to the text are very much thinking about that. They're thinking about the fact that the choice to leave out the freedom of speech guarantee from the First Amendment was a choice made in the context of thinking that the structural protections, including directly choosing by the people, would be enough. Anyway, that's enough.
Okay, so I'll go first, Grant can go second. So Larry, Richard Eakins was taught by Grant, for what it's worth, so it might explain something, I don't know. On the cultural thing, well, I think Australia just has, from about the get-go, had a total rejection of the natural law thinking. Sort of a mild Benthamite thinking might be a better way to describe the Australian thing. There's a certain skepticism of intellectualism, which means that in Australia your top lawyers, and there is a split profession in most states, so the top barristers really could care less what's happening in the law schools. And there's this thought that, well, there's the law schools, and they might all be 99% pro-Bill of Rights, pro-Democrat Party equivalent, so that, John McGuinness's study on voting habits, you could take that and multiply by an order of magnitude in Australia, but they don't really care. And so it doesn't have the culture in the law schools doesn't seem to creep over. The case you were talking about is the federalism one, I think, on work choices, where they use the corporation's power, which Laurie reminded me was 5120, in order to extend what in effect were labor relations laws. The High Court in Australia has totally killed federalism. They make your court here look like they're federalism protectors. The irony, of course, is Canada, which was designed to be centralized, has the judges have given the provinces immense power. I mean, Quebec basically runs its own immigration policy, and that's partly because the appeals would go to the Supreme Court of Canada early on, and then to the Privy Council. And the Privy Council would always overrule the Canadian Supreme Court and go with the provinces because they were independent, and the centralized judges would. And Stephen, well, two things. Firstly, there is a High Court of Australia judge who's retiring next month. His name is Hayden, and he is a very good originalist. He's become so dissatisfied that he's writing dissents that make Scalia look mild. If you do nothing else, go and get a case called Monsilovich, and just read Hayden's dissent, which I paraphrase off the top of my head. One of my favorite Scalias, and I can't remember what it's called, is the one where he's talking about some golf guy who wants to drive around. Wants to drive around the golf cart. Somewhere in there, Scalia says, I'm a short, fat little Italian guy who's always wanted to be a pro baseball player, and he uses that to be fairly biting. Well, Hayden starts his off something like the warm glow of human rights thinking, and he then just becomes vitriolic, and it's so funny. So I don't, and that was going to lead up to your point that everywhere is different, and then you said things like, and I just wrote down. I mean, I love this. This is argument by pronoun. They, and you said we about 3 times, but the we is never me. The we is always 5 out of 9 judges. I don't know why that's we any more than the guys who designed the Constitution 100 or 200 years ago. When Kirby says we, I want to be sick. It's not we, it's you. I haven't had any say at all, as far as I can tell. So I don't really buy the argument by pronoun. The Australian legal culture at the top end of the judges, as Grant says, wishes they were on the American Supreme Court. The fact that the most activist judge in Australia a few years back was a guy named Michael Kirby, if you took him and parked him on the Canadian Supreme Court today, he'd be the most interpretively conservative judge, easily. So that's a pretty big difference between Australia and Canada. Laurie. Well, I mean, I did start with ACTV just so I could get to the voting rights cases of Roach and Roe, which are much more egregious. That said, we're going to disagree about ACTV in this sense. The the phrase is directly chosen by the people. So what you have to do, first of all, is take the adverb directly and throw it out and pay no attention to directly. Because if you're going to get this argument going about representative government, you're going to smuggle in all these freestanding ethical arguments about, and there's a certain plausibility to this idea that you're not choosing as a voter unless there's some sort of flow of information. I got all that. But any originalist, I take it, is going to go and see what were they worried about when they used the phrase directly chosen by the people. Realizing that the U.S. hadn't passed the 19th Amendment yet, they didn't really like indirectly elected senates, they didn't like the Electoral College, and they wanted directly elected MPs. That seems to me what it's like. And you also have to realize that in Australia, the background is parliamentary sovereignty, which it still has in New Zealand. So here's what you say in New Zealand. If the parliament threatens to pass some egregious law where you don't let people vote, or you don't have any more elections, or you can't go to court and overturn it. That's what they're used to in Australia. I quite like that. I think Australia's constitutional record on rights stands up to anywhere with a written constitution, but, I know that Tom said that he can't imagine a good constitution without the 14th Amendment. Maybe your imagination needs a little bit more. But anyway, so look, I don't agree that the most plausible originalist interpretation of the Australian Constitution is to take the 4 words in Section 7 and 24 and make them do what you want. That said, Laurie's right to this extent, I think. In the aftermath of ACTV, they actually haven't struck down any more statutes. They argue it in the High Court. There's a whole stream of cases where they argue it, and then inevitably the High Court says, well, that statute's okay, because they came under a lot of flack, and there's nothing to point to in the Constitution. I think that inhibits you.
I just want to say something what Larry said first, and then something to Laurie, and then Larry and Laurie. Larry, the U.S. You're asking what the differences in legal cultures. Here's what I think that characterizes that's important, and I'll just use Canada for this example. The Canadian constitutional order, I think, is a lot more, I would call it judge or court-centric, in a way that I don't think Americans would tolerate. Now, I might be wrong on this, but I remember Fred Schauer years ago said something that I've quoted from time to time. Fred described judicial review as a sort of an aberrant institution, democratically speaking, but one that was tolerated. But because of that, the idea was that it always had to be, its justification or its legitimacy was never taken for granted, and there was internal constraints on how far it would go as a result. I hope I'm doing Fred justice in that, and I don't know if he still thinks that, but I recall him saying that. But the point is, that kind of thinking is nowhere in Canada. There's absolutely, virtually no opposition to judicial review per se. And so the Canadian constitutional order has judges that are sort of self-defining of how powerful they're going to be. And the only thing that prevents them going a lot is their modesty, their own sense of humility in this. And some of the reasons for that are structural. The Canadian Constitution, unlike the Australian one, unlike the New Zealand, unlike the UK, unlike certainly the US, the court in Canada can give advisory opinions. There is no, I've forgotten the phrase. There's no case or controversy rule in Canada. And so it's quite not unusual at all to go cap in hand to the court. So the federal government, the Prime Minister, will direct a reference question to the court and will say, may we please legislate on this matter? And sometimes the court says no. Quite often the court says no. And I always say, it's easier to get forgiveness and approval. Pass the damn law and then make them strike it down. That's Huscroft's approach, who believes in coordinate interpretation of the Constitution.
He's married.
But it's quite, so we've just sent, even last week, another reference question to the court, a series of 8 or 10 questions. May we please change the way Canadian senators are appointed? Is that within our power federally? Can we do that? On and on and on and on. And that's a very different fact of the Canadian constitutional order. We don't, and that's a reflection of the weaker separation of powers as well, right? You build judges into your public policy in that kind of way. And then when they get to the Bill of Rights interpretation, the Charter of Rights, again, their only constraint is their own confidence, and do we think we're good enough at this, and whatever. And so I was interested in the John McGuinness's paper on restraint for that reason. Judicial review in places like Canada is often sold on the basis of restraint. Don't worry, we will defer to the legislature. Well, they'll defer when they damn well feel like it. And you can never tell when they're going to is the problem. And that is certainly observable in the UK, and it's observed the deference problem. It's very unpredictable, and in New Zealand as well. So different orders based on, I think, judges having a different sense of the legitimacy in the order and having more power as a result. Laurie's point, I'm going to answer with something Jeff Goldsworthy said. I'm going to probably mangle this paraphrase too, but I don't like the argument that it's sort of, what if the government banned political advertising altogether or did something really heinous? Isn't it a good thing that the judges take these vague words and infer a right out of it to stop that? That is an argument that you can only make if you're confident that they won't go beyond that egregious hypothetical that you just set out as the justification for giving them that power. And I'd rather say, that hypo is unlikely to come up, so let's not invent a power to imply rights out of the Constitution to address it. If it does come up, then lie or do whatever you have to stop it, but don't invent a theory of implying rights from the Constitution. Otherwise, you get, without the people assenting, and in fact with the people having rejected it consciously several times, you get a de facto Bill of Rights. You get a de jure Bill of Rights articulated by the judges. And I just realized something, sorry to go on, but I promised you I was going to say something provocative about proportionality and so forth, the balancing idea. I'll pick up on again, Laurie's remarks about liberty. In a lot of the countries with bills of rights now, and Canada is sort of creeping in this direction, forget interpretation. Nobody's even interested in it. It's considered legalism, and it's like that. So Matthias Kuhn at NYU says, all you have in virtue of having a right is a requirement that the state justify its actions. Since justification is inherently a good thing, why not interpret every right so broadly as possible? Therefore, we end up with just one general right to liberty. Therefore, every law infringes a right. Therefore, every law must be justified. And then we get into proportionality and weighing analysis. And that is not a parody. That is what Matthias Kuhn says. That is what European proportionality looks like. No interest at all in statutory interpretive theory, whether it be even living constitutionalism. They don't care about that. They just want to get right to the proportionality. So forget what the wording that's in your Bill of Rights. They just get right to the weighing. And so the rest of the world is doing constitutional law way differently than we're talking about here. And again, that's why I wanted I'm all for comparative study. I think it's great and interesting, but geez, you got to be careful about finding cases. You can find a lot of cases that are really odd based on entirely different conceptions of judicial roles and propriety and so forth than what I think you have in America.
You want to get on the queue, Randy?
No, I'm good.
Is he a proportionality guy?
Just a response to him, which is, I'm perfectly willing to concede that 5 swallows do not make a summer out of 9. But so one case, you lose, a couple cases you lose, no problem. But at some point, if enough people are a non-originalist for enough time, you lose. And
Sure.
It's like, it's like the Tories, and it's like a guy I knew in college used to toast the restoration of the Stuarts. So the important point is, how do we know that originalism hasn't lost in the United States or in Australia or anywhere else? So what is the evidence that's relevant to that question? I don't think it has, and so I'm developing my own theory as to why that's true. It seems to me that that's a really important question that Matt Adler, among other people, has been sort of encouraging people to focus their time on that I just haven't seen
It's
very much.
lost in Canada, I agree with you. It's gone.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
that I just don't see a lot of people working on, and I think maybe they should.
Right, Mike Ramsey.
Yeah, well, this is...
No, sorry, I'm going to name the 3. I'll name the 3. It's Mike Ramsey, Earl Maltz, and then John McGinnis.
All right, well, this is a fun paper, and thanks very much for it. And I think it stimulates a lot of the things that I'm interested in people taking off with, and along the lines of what Larry Solomon was suggesting. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in this area. So I just wanted to explore a little bit the question of if the big difference between Australia and the United States is the lack of Bill of Rights in this sense. Just think about what that might do to the legal culture to not have a Bill of Rights. And you've already, I think you sort of touched on some of these points already, but again, I'll go ahead and raise them anyway. At the risk of some very substantial oversimplification and caricature, it would seem in the United States that when we talk about judicial departure from originalism, in the area of rights, we're often talking about over-enforcement. Not always, but that's where you look to see that the judge is getting way beyond the original understanding that's in the area of rights. In contrast, in the area of structure, you see under-enforcement to a very dramatic extent in a number of areas. And so one might hypothesize that a Bill of Rights encourages judges to stretch. And you have examples of judges stretching without a Bill of Rights. But the question is, the question in this direction in my mind is it an equivalent amount of stretching? Or is it stretching from a much lower base, as it were, which it sort of seems to me like the latter in the comments that you said, that these are the egregious decisions. Well, interpretively speaking, they may be egregious, but in terms of the sorts of rights they establish compared to some rights that have been established out of things other than originalism in the United States, they're not really that big a deal.
Yes and yes.
So that sort of then leads to another question, or a related question I have about the flip side of this. If that's the over enforcement, the flip side, and actually the area that I'm more interested in, which is the under enforcement of structure. And so the question I was going to ask, and again I think you've sort of answered it in previous comments, but I will push on anyway. Does the absence of a Bill of Rights, if it constrains the legal culture in its tendency to over-enforce, does that play out in the under-enforcement as well? Is there less under-enforcement if you don't have the distortion of a Bill of Rights? Because I think the Bill of Rights puts a lot of pressure on originalism under this idea. And so my question was going to be: is there a culture of originalism, or at least of formalism, in the structural aspects of the Australian Constitution? If the structural aspects of the Australian Constitution become the larger part of the Constitution, the action here is often in the rights, but you don't have the rights, so the action must be in the structure. Does that make the judges more active, or at least more interventionist in the structure? It sounded to me like, though, you were saying that it actually doesn't, that in fact the judges in Australia under-enforce on structure somewhat in parallel to the United States. So I'm just sort of curious about what you think about what the absence of a Bill of Rights does to the legal culture as by comparison to the United States.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. If you believe in popular sovereignty, it seems to me, why do you believe in judicial review at all? I actually don't believe in judicial review at all, so that's the right position, and forced to have it by originalism. But if your defense is popular sovereignty, why believe in judicial review at all?
John?
I guess my take on what I take from some of these papers and my own experience in going to Australia and talking to some of the issues there, about some of the issues there, is sort of the opposite, I guess, of Larry's, that there are some cultural forces against originalism that are common in all advanced democratic societies. I mean, you mentioned, although not discussed in this paper, the death of federalism in Australia and the engineers case in Australia, and that seems to me that there's consolidation because special interests have an interest in consolidation. They don't like the structure of exit of federalism. There becomes the culture of maybe the celebrity of the judge who can be the moral leader. I think you see that in these decisions, to be sure, from a lower level, as Mike suggests, but it's much more exciting to do that than just to be a humble arbiter of the law. And finally, there's pressure from the lawyer class, which is interested in change. I think they derive their income from change in the regulatory state. And so there are all these powerful common forces throughout the advanced democratic societies that I think are very much against a originalist structure. And the reason I raise this is because I think there is an important question for originalism, which is how beyond the formal arguments for originalism, how does one create a culture of originalism against what I see as very powerful forces that are deep within modern democratic societies with their own legal culture and their own culture of special interest, particularly in federalist societies like Australia and the United States. So that's my concern, and I wonder whether you have any thoughts about that, because I take a rather pessimistic story about originalism from about the possibility of sustaining originalism, however powerful the intellectual arguments are for it.
So I'll just be quick. So firstly, for Mike, I mean, I agreed on your early point, but I suppose what I'd say is, originalism you might contrast it to some sort of living constitutionalism or Dworkinian moral reading or best fit on a rights-related issue. But if you're dealing with a federalism issue, which I take it you mean the structural elements of this, so let's say it's a federalism issue, you might be contrasting originalist interpretation with a sort of an unbelievably narrow literalism, or where you don't look behind the words at all. And that, I think, is largely, I'm going to defer to Laurie possibly, but the problem with Australian federalism is they read the enumerated powers for the centre. They don't do the Canadian pith and substance thing. They just see, is there any plausible way at all to stretch what they're doing under any of the enumerated powers? And if you can find any literal meaning at all, then the centre gets it. So, they almost always, the corporation's power they use in the most, and it's a literalist sort of textualist analysis, but it's not originalist. They don't stop and say, what really was going on here when they drafted, what were they thinking, what do the words mean in the, they don't do that. And so when you say formalist, I'd say textualist. I'm not sure that's the kind of thing I mean by originalism. I don't think it's what Larry means, but I'm not even sure living constitution interpretation makes any sense in a federalism issue because, you're just splitting up power. So what does it mean to say it's a living constitution? Well, in Australia, it just means the feds always win. If you're betting in Australia, bet on the center. So that takes me to Earl. And I just don't think I think you can make a case, Earl, that there's a difference between what judges are doing when they're interpreting a rights document with morally pregnant phrases in terms of democratic legitimacy or, the counter-majoritarian problem or whatever you want to say, on the one hand, and I don't like that, and on the other hand saying, judicial review in the sense of federalism is a little bit different. I wrote a whole paper in a British thing sort of setting out this argument, and a friend in Australia didn't talk to me for 2 years, but look, if you have two democratically elected bodies and your job is to say you get the power or you don't, and if you don't get it, you do, and if you don't get it, you do, that doesn't seem to me as egregious. And it might be part of the bargain to just have a country, and you're not really throwing too much down the democratic thing. Okay, it's true that you might get a judge who manipulates and they say, okay, I'm more likely to get gay marriage out of the center than I am out of the state. But that's just dishonest interpretation. That, any theory could give you that. So I think you can make a much more powerful defense of federalist judicial review from the point of view of a strong democratic majoritarian than you can of rights-related judicial review. And I won't go into that argument, but I'll give you a copy if you want. For John, yeah, you can be pessimistic, and you're less pessimistic in Australia, I think, than Canada. The thing that sort of keeps originalism going in Australia is you get a handful of top students come out of the 4 or 5 best law schools where they've been indoctrinated by anti-originalist thinking, and they end up being the top barristers, and they get appointed to the court, and they don't really pay too much attention to. And I don't know how long that can keep going. And there's a few, but there are people out there, which is maybe an answer to the earlier question, There are judges who are originalists, and there are a few law professors. You know, there are no Jeff Goldsworthys in Canada. Grant, my moderate friend in my thinking, he seemed to be sort of beyond the pale. So you just cannot explain the difference really in the legal culture in that sense. Now, having said that, as Mike Ramsey will know, if you go into the self-proclaimed leading law school in Australia, Melbourne, you've got the Palestinian wall and the oppressed women wall, and you know they only have 4 walls, so they run out of oppressed people. And there's no real concern about doing legalism. It's emoting and it's social justice. But if you overdo that, I think the smarter students just become totally inured to it. Now I could be wrong.
Can I just say one thing about John, in response to what John said, which is a funny remark in amongst a bunch of American scholars, but I mean, the rejection of originalism in Canada was in part a rejection of it because it's American. That's important to appreciate. It's country differentiation. Originalism could flourish in Australia under the radar for a long time. There was no Bill of Rights. The moment we had a charter in Canada, and somebody started making an argument, right off the bat, the federal government was in court saying, no, here's how this is supposed to be interpreted. Here's what we were thinking. We only wrote this a couple of years ago. The court just threw that all out, and the timing was important. It was because the court was rejecting the parodied version of Robert Bork and that whole failed episode. Robert Bork's originalism, original intent originalism, was rejected. They never considered new originalism in Canada or anything like that. They just got rid of that one with all the political baggage that it was perceived as coming with. That was, people in Canada were saying when Ted Kennedy was going after Bork in the Senate, yeah, you go, Ted. Yeah, that was the response. And we didn't want our legal system to be like that. And the judges in Canada thought, we will do nothing to make this charter stillborn. We got to make it vibrant. That was the concern, and judges were appointed that wanted to run with the charter, on the argument being we've been entrusted with this. We are the new guardians of the constitutional order.
You should mention the fundamental justice point on the Canadian Constitution, because that just makes the point really.
Well, the one Jim's referring to is a provision in the Canadian Charter about a right to fundamental justice for any deprivation of life, liberty, or security. It is pretty well easily established on any kind of originalist analysis what's going on there. That's a legal right in terms of interactions with the legal system. If your liberty is going to be taken from you, if your the security of the person doesn't have any inherent meaning, so that's a nice extravagantly vague phrase, as Tim Endicott would call it. But
and they specifically didn't want to use due process because they knew the American law.
They said, let's not use the phrase due process because we don't want to get into that Lochner stuff. My God, that was a bad era. And so they said, what do we do? And someone said, let's use the phrase fundamental justice. That'll stop that. I'm not kidding. You couldn't make this up.
Yeah.
They looked at the record and they said, that's how we will avoid it. You can see it in the debates in the Canadian Senate and Parliament about the charter rights. So they adopt this, and everybody says, and it will be procedural justice only. It will not have any substantive component. We've avoided that. No substantive due process for us. Well, what did the court do? 3 years after the charter's passed, the court said fundamental justice means substantive fundamental justice. And you look at it and you say, well, I guess we're done here then. And that provision is the one that everything gets challenged under now. You want to strike down a law against assisted suicide? There's your one. You want to strike down a law against polygamy? Have a go there. Section 7, this fundamental justice provision, allows you to weigh the substantive justice inherent in any law. If you can establish a deprivation of life, liberty, or security. And they're making it pretty easy to do that. The Canadian healthcare system that you've all heard about, that a lot of people didn't want to have, that is under challenge under the fundamental justice section. And you're thinking, there is no right to health care. Well, and there isn't. There's no economic and social rights explicitly in the Canadian Charter. It is a civil and political rights, negative rights sort of a document. But you can take the words security of the person, and you can run an argument that goes like this. I'm on a waiting list in the public health system for health care. That's bad for me and my right to life and security of the person. The government has to justify this substantively as a matter of fundamental justice. The government's in real trouble on that one, unless the court against what John would want to do is wildly unprincipled deferential and says, well, it's hard to run a health system, so we'll just defer to your judgments about these waiting lists and that kind of thing. But that's the only way that's going to come out satisfactorily in light of the way, original intentions, original meaning, everything was abandoned for the fundamental justice provision.
Well, we have a lot more people on the queue, but I think we're at 5:45, so I hope you can chat over dinner.
You can do it.